I'd like to welcome you all to our presentation today. I'm Wanda Stutsman, and today we are going to be talking about shade gardening, how to effectively plant in a shady area in your landscape. Today's presentation is brought to you by Texas Master Gardeners, TRWD is Tarrant Regional Water District, and Texas A&M AgriLife Extension. TRWD maintains 4 aerial lakes and pipelines needed to provide surface water to local water treatment plants so they can clean it to meet drinking water standards for our communities. They also work with many cities in Tarrant County, such as Fort Worth. Conservation is an important water supply strategy to help meet the needs of a growing population. There are currently 2.3 million people in Tarrant County. That's a lot of people, and this is expected to double over the next 50 years. That is why TRWD supports many programs that help save water through outdoor watering and gardening education at SaveTarrantWater.com. You can sign up on their website for free watering advice. You can sign up for a free sprinkler check, and then they have calendars of events, classes, and water saving tips and videos. So I encourage you all to go to SaveTarrantWater.com to help us conserve water for our next generations. So let's just get right into shade gardening. Types of shade. All of us have some sort of shade, either from the form of trees in our yards or neighbors' houses or fencing. There's full shade, which is usually in a dense tree population. Dappled shade, where it might be just a sparse planting of trees. And then it's sun part of the day. So you may have morning sun, afternoon shade, midday sun, and morning and evening shade, and then late afternoon sun, which is brutal to our landscapes, and almost none of the plants we're going to talk about today will survive in late afternoon sun. It seems kind of funny that none of us are going to have morning sun on all 4 sides of our house, but a lot of these plants that I'm going to talk to you about today thrive in morning sun only. So if you were to plant all of these plants, you would have only half of your landscape fully planted with beautiful plants, and the other half that gets the afternoon sun, you would have to go to your drought-tolerant perennials, Texas natives, and put on the other side of your house. And a lot of us do that in our landscapes. We have different types of gardening depending on the shade we have in our landscape. There are also shade patterns. Permanent full shade is shade that's going to be like under a live oak or an other evergreen that is a tree that does not lose its leaves during the winter. Or under a roof or an eave. I just put in a new bed, and there's an eave area that does not get any sun, but the rest of the garden that extends out past the house gets a lot of full sun. So it's interesting. I haven't found a right plant to go in that area. And then we have the shady in the summer, but not in the winter. And that's more of your deciduous trees like your post oaks, your maples, things like that. And a lot of the plants we're going to talk about today thrive in that environment because they get the winter sun to help set their bloom buds, and they need that. Things like daffodils and azaleas and things. Plants like that would love to be under deciduous trees. There's shade from a building as the sun moves west in the summer, and I have that scenario at my house. I think we all probably do, but the sun changes position across the roof of my home from summer to winter, and so if you were just to move into the home in the spring, you'd think this is a full sun area. In the winter, it would be shade. So it's, you definitely have to pay attention to that. Shade gardening is all about layering. We start with from the top going down. Obviously, the shade is produced by something. In this case, we're going to consider it produced by deciduous or evergreen trees. Underneath that tree canopy, We're going to put understory trees. Understory trees are going to be things like red buds, dogwoods. We're going to put foliage shrubs in there. We're going to put flowering shrubs, and there's a difference there. Some shrubs are only green, don't have hardly any flower that's visible or berry that's visible, and then there's flowering shrubs that have a lot of things, and those would maybe be your hydrangeas and such. Then we'll layer in ferns, perennial plants, bulbs, which we cannot forget about our bulbs. They're the little surprise plant in our garden. And then any kind of ground covers or vines that we might want to add in. So it's a layering effect to get your shade garden going. So now let's talk about foliage shrubs and trees. These are larger shrubs that act as a great anchor or weight in the back of a shade garden. Here we have Akuba, redbud, viburnum, a lot of plants that migrated here from Japan. Most of these are, or in fact all of these are not native to Texas. They work really well as adding some interest and texture to a shade garden. Akuba japonica, it's a really neat plant. It's spotted, has a waxy leaf. It adds a nice dense texture to the back of a shade garden. It doesn't require hardly any light. In fact, it won't do well in any sun. I love it because it just is so contrasting to a lot of the other shade plants that we put in our gardens. It does have an issue with fungus if it's overwatered, so you do have to keep up with that. This is definitely something that you would start your layering with, put it in the back of the flower bed as an anchor. The Aralias. Aralias are another waxy leaf. They look very tropical. There's a variegated one, as you can see here in the top of your screen. And I've seen them where the variegation is more pronounced than splattered like that. Anyhow, so it's always nice to add variegated plants in a dark area because it adds a pop of light in your dense flower bed. So if your flower bed is very dark because it's heavy tree coverage, then consider adding the Akubas, the variegated Aralias, and then we'll talk about some other variegated plants as well. But they add some interest to a dark area. So Japanese maples are one of my favorite trees. I have probably 7 to 10 of them in my yard of various sizes and shapes. They are a wonderful accent to any shade garden. They grow great under other large trees, typically only under deciduous trees. I haven't seen many Japanese maples growing under live oaks. In fact, I don't see a lot of things growing under live oaks. They are so densely covered in leaves that very little light can get through to them, and they're very acidic with their leaves. So understory tree for post oaks, that type of thing. But the Japanese maple, they add color and interest in the spring when they're setting their leaves, and then they add color and interest in the fall as the leaves fade into off the trees and we move into winter. So you can't have a shade garden without a Japanese maple. A Texas redbud is definitely a great option for a shade area and adds interest and color in the spring and foliage during the summer and fall. They come in various colors, and they do prefer not to have afternoon sun. They wilt tremendously in the afternoon sun, so morning sun only, if any sun, and great addition to a shady garden. Dogwood. We don't see a ton of these in this area, but they will grow here, and they are really, really pretty. I think I'm starting to see more and more. My favorite is the pink dogwood, and but the white is nice. And then there's also an evergreen dogwood that looks slightly different, and then there's a rough leaf dogwood. So various types of dogwoods. They all grow here in this area and make a beautiful contribution in the spring with their white or pink flowers. Claria japonica. This is also a shrub. It does have a flower. It's not real prominent. Nice green foliage. You can also get it in the variegated, which is here down at the bottom, which is really pretty. It does require some water. Most shade areas in most landscapes provide a little bit more water. The water doesn't evaporate from the soil as quickly in the shade, and so some of these plants do just fine. But do check the water requirements on all the plants you're putting in your shade area, because we do have some drought-tolerant shade plants in Texas. Sweet viburnum. This one is really nice. It smells really pretty. There's also a snowball viburnum that I have in my garden in the shade, and it's really pretty. And those can get pretty large, so you can keep them pruned back, or if you have a space that will accommodate a larger shrub, this is a great accent shrub. Pittosporum, I know everybody's probably laughing at this because everybody lost their pittosporums during our freezes in 2021, but I like the variegated pittosporum. I love the softness it provides as an anchor shrub in a shade garden. And I also love it because you can take cuttings and use them in floral arrangements, and they really are cheap, easy greenery for a floral arrangement, and they add a lot of punch. But if you really look closely at the leaves, they're very pretty. And I know that a lot of people don't want to plant them again or replace them with the same thing, but we don't have those freezes very often, and in years past they've survived our mild freezes. So consider replanting a pittosporum. So after we get through with the shrubs and the trees, now we're going to layer in things like fern. And there are a lot of different ferns for Texas. And don't forget them, because they go dormant in the winter and they come out in the spring, and they add just nice soft texture to your garden. And I recommend planting them in 3s and 5s together so that you have a nice grouping in your shade garden. So one of the first ones we're going to talk about is the autumn fern. This one is really neat because it produces such a nice golden brown foliage. It has a green foliage, and then it migrates to a brown foliage, so it's giving you some contrast in your garden. It's giving you some texture. It's really, really pretty. They can get a little larger. I mean, most of us buy our plants small, so really pay attention to how tall they get so that you can place them accordingly in your flower bed so that they're not at the front of the flower bed. Either to the side or in front of your shrubs. Texas wood fern, I love it. I do not plant it because where you plant it, it will be everywhere else. It definitely moves on you and migrates, and you'll start ripping it out by the handfuls. So if you have a shady area that is contained and you need it full to give softness to your landscape, and you really just want only one thing in it, maybe it's an area around under a tree with a tree well, or it's just a side to your patio, and you really don't want to have to plant a lot of different things, I recommend putting in Texas wood fern in that area, as long as it's contained by a sidewalk, a patio, or a edging of some sort, and just let that fill your space, and it'll be really, really pretty. Of course, it goes dormant in the winter, so that space won't look very pretty in the winter. But you can add bird feeders and things to compensate for the winter so that you can have something to enjoy beside your patio when those are dormant. Asparagus fern and foxtail fern, they both are great. Foxtail fern can handle a lot more sun. Asparagus fern as well can handle some sun. So if you have a space pretty shady morning and evening, but not in the middle of the day, consider either of these. Now, I will tell you that the asparagus fern probably would not have survived this last freeze we had. I have it only in pots and put it in a garden house. And I do believe people's foxtail fern did survive. But again, look at it planted in mass up here on the far right. It's really pretty. I really like that look. Kind of looks like the ocean floor. It's really kind of cool. Maidenhair fern. This one's a little tricky, and some people are real successful with maidenhair fern, and some people not. I tend to not be very successful with it, but you can try it, especially if you have a moist area that's a shade garden. It really requires moisture, not just necessarily on its roots, but just in the air. Dry August temperatures where our dew point is really low can affect it, cause problems. So, but it is an option. It's definitely an option. My favorite is the hollyleaf fern. I have it in a lot of places in my garden. It's just does not fail, and it doesn't go completely dormant in the winter. And so it adds a very nice green texture to your garden for the winter. And all you have to do is visit it a few times a year and cut back some of the dead fronds. And it's just a really pretty plant. It does so well here for us in Texas. So I wouldn't have a shade garden without a hollyleaf fern in it. Japanese painted fern. This one I think is neat, but I struggle with it because of the color of it. And it looks so pretty in these pictures, especially this picture here, where it kind of has moss growing below it. I don't believe that's in Texas, but I'm all about contrast color and fluidity in any of my flower beds, so I don't put certain colors together. And so I always struggle with how to match this up with other plants in the shade garden or in my garden. But it is a neat plant. It'll catch your eye if you're walking by. A lot of times conscious will say, oh, that's a snake. And it's not. It's the fern. So really, really pretty. Planted in mass is a nice addition to your shade garden. Now let's talk about foliage plants. These are smaller plants, not shrubs, that grow in a shade garden, provide a lot of interest. All of this whole list, none of them are native to Texas except for the inland sea oats. That is a native to Texas. And we'll talk about each of these as we move forward. So hostas, everybody loves hostas, and if you live up north, they're just beautiful and they're big and they're gorgeous. And my sister lives in Michigan, and her hostas are amazing, and I'm so envious. Well, we don't necessarily get that power out of our hostas here. They just are are not dormant long enough in the winter, and then in the summer when the dew point drops and the heat comes on, it dries out their leaves. But I will tell you that there's one variety, it's variegated, and it's not this one in the top, but it looks a lot like it. It's called So Sweet. I see it at the nurseries, I see it at plant sales. It is by far the one that has done the best for me. It's called So Sweet, and I love it. So anytime I need to add a hosta, I will add it. But then my neighbor right behind me has a huge, different variety, and it's just gorgeous. It's done so well for her. And it's all about placement. It's all about water. And you can definitely try hostas, but don't expect them to look like my sister's in Michigan. Umbrella plant. This also can be a little invasive. There's two varieties. There's a dwarf and a tall one that maybe you would see in a pond or near marshland. The dwarf one spreads pretty crazy in your garden, so put it in an area that you want to keep it contained. The tall one can get pretty tall and lanky, and I have it next to a fountain in my shade garden. It's really pretty. Again, the taller variety can go in, be submerged in water and survive just fine, but adds more texture to the landscape. This one took a beating for most of us with this freeze that we just had. It's a great plant to put in our landscapes because the wind catches it and it flows back and forth, and it's really pretty, and it adds movement to your garden, and movement is always important, and I love it. There's also a variety called Milky Way. It's a smaller variety, and it has white spots all over it, little bitty white spots, just like the stars in the sky. It's a great addition to your yard as well. It doesn't spread as quickly and it's newer to our garden centers. But look for it. It's called Milky Way aspidistra. And then with aspidistra, if it does get freeze burn, you can cut it back and it will come back. And mine did. The problem is it doesn't come back in the same spot. It migrates out from the center, a lot like irises do. It'll migrate out from where you plant it. So it just keeps going further out and further out. And then you have a hole in the middle. And that's what I have from this last freeze that we had. So maybe I should take some and replant it back in the middle. Not sure what to do there. Airplane plants. A lot of people grow these and they bring them in house plants. They put them in pots, hang them on their patios. They will actually grow in the ground here. And I love the variegation. And they can be an edging of some sort. We're going to talk about liriope, but they can be confused with liriope, especially a variegated liriope. But anyhow, the airplane plant can grow in the ground and does add a lot of interest to your garden. Inland sea oats. This is for an area that might be a little bit more harder to plant area. Inland sea oats do like shade, and all those little seeds right there will fall off and propagate elsewhere and migrate into your garden, and in your landscape. So be really careful with inland sea oats where you plant them, and they add a little rattling noise. Seeds dry, you can hear them in the fall. That's kind of neat, a little shaky, rattling noise. So as the breeze blows, again, adding something to your garden, movement, noise, sound, but be really careful where you plant these. Ajuga. Ajuga comes in a lot of different forms. We have Caitlin's Giant, we have a variegated, we have the tiny little chocolate chip ajuga. There are lots of them. You cannot go wrong with right at the front of your flower bed, just putting a spot of ajuga here and a spot of ajuga there. I will tell you that ajuga really needs to be under deciduous trees so that it can set its flower stalks in the spring. They will not flower, it will not flower very well if it's under really, really heavy evergreen trees like a live oak or something, or hollies. It really wants that early spring sun to set its flowers. But the variegated with the purple and the white and the green is one of my most favorite additions to my garden. Liriope. A lot of people frown on liriope, and for good reason. I mean, it can get out of control. It's big, it's lumpy, it doesn't seem to want to do anything for your garden. But if you really study the plant, you'll see that the big liriope does have a beautiful flower stalk that it will send up once a year, and has really pretty purple blooms. And the way you handle the larger varieties of liriope is that in February and not later, you cut it back, and so the new growth can come up and look pretty. A lot of us fail to cut the liriope, so the old foliage looks tattered and worn and brown on the tips, and we don't, and so it just doesn't look good, and we just get frustrated. So it has to be done in February before the new shoots come up. But there are also other varieties of liriope. There's variegated that adds a lot of interest to your flower bed. There's the dwarf mondo. There's just a mondo, which I have a lot of and really like the way it looks. The dwarf mondo, this little bitty one right here, is when you plant it, this is what I do. If I get a 4-inch pot of it, I take it and I pull it all apart. I pull it all apart. I make trenches in 2 or 3 inch trenches in the ground, and I layer all of those roots in the ground, and I backfill with dirt. If you plant just that 4-inch pot, take it out of the pot, put it in the ground, most likely it's never going to move. It's never going to grow out. It's going to take years. You'll be dead before the fills in. So I just take it, pull it apart, make individual little groupings, and lay it in a trench and backfill it. And you'll be really surprised how well that fills in compared to just planting the 4-inch pot. Arum italicum. This is something that most people around here don't have. Arum, there's a lot of varieties. However, it grows. This foliage comes up in the winter. It starts coming up in November. It's up until March when the sun comes out and your trees start setting their leaves. It dies back and it sends up a seed stalk just like this, and it's really pretty. So it almost looks like an elephant ear, almost looks like a caladium, but it grows in the winter. I have it under my Japanese maples in with my Wanda grass. So when it dies back, it's down underneath the Wanda grass. The one thing about arum that is important to know is that the bulb that is at the bottom of the stalk goes way down in the ground. So when you start wanting to share or dig it up to move it, you want to do this in March when it's starting to die back. When you start to do that, most likely you're going to chop off the stems and not get the root ball. So you have to be really careful, kind of come at it from a side to dig it up. But a really cool plant comes in a lot of different leaf colors or in textures. Leopard plant. This is kind of our go-to plant now that we're trying to encourage people to plant instead of hostas, because they do not tend to fade in August when the heat comes on and the temperatures get really hot and dry. So a leopard plant, I love this glossy leaf, almost looks like a water lily that's not in water. And then there's some with spots, there's some with a lot of spots, there's some that are curly. They're really coming out with a big variety of them. So they're definitely shade loving. Some of them can get very large. This variety down here, there's actually a gigantic one where the leaves are about this big and it stands about 4 or 5 feet tall. Really cool plant. Definitely adds an element to your garden that you wouldn't have. But these survived our winter. They died back. They survived that freeze. They did come back all the way from the ground. In most winters, they don't completely die back to the ground. And they do like water, and they do great in the shade. So it's also called farfugium, leopard plant or farfugium, quite a few varieties. And Dusty Miller, I use this very sparingly in my garden because it's such a eye-catching color, and I know it looks really good as up in here where it's a mass planting, but of course most of us think of it almost as an annual in putting it in our pots, our annual pots and things, but you can actually put it in the ground, and in most winters will survive in Texas. But if you want to add a light color somewhere in your garden, maybe near the Japanese painted fern, then you might consider the Dusty Miller. Variegated flax lily. Again, this is going to look a lot like your liriope. It's going to look a lot like airplane plant, but it's an option. It's definitely an option for your garden if you don't want to go the liriope route. And see how it's planted in this top picture right behind the oxalis? Makes a great combination. Euphorbias. A lot of us don't have these in our garden. You have to sort of learn how to grow them. I have killed a few of them, but not on purpose. And so they're just beautiful. They add such color and texture. There's so many varieties, but study up on them. Study up on the conditions that are required for them and how not to kill them. A great accent. So let's talk about perennials. I know we just talked about flowering plants, but these, a lot of these are going to be more of our Texas native or adaptive plants. And these are definitely needed in the garden. Columbine. I don't know how many varieties of columbine, and they're so sweet. They just fill the garden full of color early in April and March, and just so pretty. So the yellow is the most prevalent, that's the Texas native, but then there are other varieties as well. Turk's cap is a great plant. It can do sun, it can do shade. So if you have an area that's shade that gets afternoon sun, you can put Turk's cap right there and you can create shade for your other plants in that area that are behind it. So Turk's cap will do the morning shade, afternoon sun. It'll grow large. It can get 5-6 feet tall. It can get wide. A lot of times you have to really manage it in your garden over the years so that it doesn't get too big, but it will actually produce shade for the other plants in your shade garden. So remember that. You really have to think about those things as you're planting. It comes in pink and red. It's really a nice addition and great for drought-tolerant landscapes. Larkspur. Larkspur is a great addition to a shade garden, especially one that might get a little bit of morning sun. This is a reseeding annual. So of all the plants that we've talked about today, this is going to be an annual. Most everything else is a perennial that we've spoken about. So anyhow, that's really nice. It attracts bees and butterflies, and it just gives you a little bit of interest in your shade garden. Azaleas. We can grow them here in Texas. I have some, and a few of mine did not survive the freeze, but the rest of them did. I like azaleas under things like Japanese maples, dogwoods, and the dogwood and the azalea are great companion plants. Both like the same types of soil, so if you're feeding azaleas, that helps the dogwood as well. But they're really pretty. Try to avoid midday to late afternoon sun on your azaleas, but they do need a little bit of sun. If they do not get any, they may not bloom well for you. I like the oak leaf hydrangeas. I know a lot of people will have hydrangeas. I have regular hydrangeas. They do okay for us here in Texas. But the oak leaf hydrangeas are just awesome. And there's a lot of varieties, and these flower blooms here can be large on some, small on some. But what I love most about oak leaf hydrangeas is that in the fall, the color of the leaves is just phenomenal. It adds so much to your garden and interest that you can still enjoy your garden in the fall by seeing the beautiful, beautiful color. So here in Texas, you know, we're a little lacking on some of our fall tree color, you know, trees turning leaf colors. And so really, really encourage oak leaf hydrangeas to sort of add that look of the fall colors to your garden. Camellia. I have several camellias in my yard. One of them took a huge hit from the freeze. The other was protected from 2 exterior walls. The freeze was brutal on the camellia, but I cut it back to the ground and it's sending out new foliage. And it's coming out in a bush shape, which is what I intend. Sometimes when you cut a shrub back, it comes out in a totally different shape than what it was prior to a freeze or a disease or something. But camellias do grow here, and I do recommend them. They make a great color pop in the winter, and they do like a little bit of morning sun. Rose of Sharon. I have several of these. All of these in these pictures here are single blooms, and they're beautiful, and they bloom from April all the way to September or October. It comes in a lot of varieties. It has the double blooms, handles a lot of shade very well. It attracts hummingbirds, it attracts bees. They do drop their buds on the ground, so it can be a little messy, but really a nice addition to a garden, and they can take some sun. In fact, they can take a little bit of afternoon sun. So they're kind of a dual purpose plant, do shade or sun. They bloom really, really well in full sun. It's going to be a show plant the whole growing season. And then the star of a lot of shade gardens are the Lenten Rose hellebores. It's amazing how many varieties of these have come out. They do really, really well in shade here in Texas as long as they have water. They're not a drought tolerant plant at all. They do best under deciduous trees like post oaks and such. And they are just beautiful. Every year they can bloom a little differently, different times of year. Like this year, they really didn't take off until after the freeze. They did come back from the freeze. They got hit pretty hard. But I know that these plants grow in Tennessee and further north, and so they obviously can handle those really, really hard freezes. But they come in white, purple, lots of different colors. They have double blooms, really, really pretty. And so I really consider these as the star of the shade garden. Coralberry. Now this is native to Texas. It's grows, sends out its shoots, and it can migrate across a flower bed by rerooting those stems as it grows. So you kind of have to keep it in check. But it'll produce these really nice berries. It adds a little more dense shrub effect to a shade garden, and it is a little bit more drought tolerant than some of the others that we've mentioned here today. American Beautyberry. This is something that I have both the white and the purple. Love both of them. They're very easy to propagate in the spring when they set their new foliage. You can cut the viable stems and root them pretty easily. They also drop their seeds and propagate on their own. So you see these in the forest a lot because the birds have eaten the seeds and dropped them in other places. So it can be a little invasive in some gardens. But anyhow, so there is a white variety out there. It's hard to come by, but they call this one the pink or purple American Beautyberry. It's really pretty and adds some real interest. Those color seeds will show up in September to October. Bridal Respirea. Oh my gosh, this one down here on the bottom is just gorgeous. If you want an eye-popping addition to a dark landscape where it's heavy shade, I would, under deciduous trees, I'd definitely put a Bridal Respirea. The blooms might be a little short-lived. Start to bloom in March and may only bloom for 3 to 4 weeks, and then the leaves come out. But man, what an addition to a garden. It's so pretty. Caria japonica is almost just like the Bridal Respirea, but it's in the yellow. This is the double bloom where the blooms are a little bit more fluffy. And I have this in areas where I want a really nice pop of color in March and April. And it's almost like forsythia, but a little different. So bulbs, don't forget your bulbs. These are like the little surprise plant of your flower beds. Even in the sun flower beds, don't forget your bulbs. If you become a master gardener, you have the opportunity to buy bulbs. And so I have thousands of bulbs in my garden now, and I just get so excited every time they start coming up and blooming. So we have oxalis, which this is one of my most favorite plants. People call it shamrock plant, people call it purple shamrock. Anyhow, these are just a great addition to bordering walkways, shady walkways, sidewalks, shady areas around pools, things like that. Daffodils. Just tuck them in under some of your perennials that maybe don't start coming up until June or July, or really putting their foliage on. So any of your smaller shrubs that are deciduous, if you plant good grouping of daffodil bulbs in and around those, then in February, March, you'll get some interest in your garden. And then as their foliage starts to fade, the perennial plant that you had planted there takes over, and you don't have to cut the foliage back. You just leave the daffodils to absorb back into the ground, with their foliage can deteriorate underneath that perennial. There's all kinds of spider lilies, rain lilies. I had no idea how many lilies there were, but great additions to your garden. There's schoolhouse lilies. Search out some bulbs and lilies and put those in your garden. You will not be disappointed. Elephant ears. And I do have elephant ears that come back. In fact, I have some that came back from this freeze we just had. I did put a heavy layer of mulch over them before the freeze, and I just really didn't expect it to be successful. Now, any that were in pots, those did not survive, but elephant ears add a great tropical interest to a garden, and so I definitely encourage you to find a place in your yard to plant one or two. Obviously, you can't fail with them in pots as well for the summer. So now we're just into ground covers and vines. So we got our layers all going, and now if you have a larger space and you need a ground cover, or if you need a vine to maybe go up over a fence or something, let's just talk about a few here. So we have English ivy and Boston ivy. Don't confuse the Boston ivy with your creeper that a lot of us get. That is more of a nuisance vine than the Boston ivy. But both are great. I had them both at my other house, and they took over a fence, and if you really have to maintain them so that they don't get out of hand. Asiatic jasmine. I have a home down the street from us that has their whole landscape is Asiatic jasmine. They mow it. They have a crew that comes in and mows it a few times a year. And it's nice. I mean, it is nice. I think they could fertilize and improve the quality of it in their garden. But it definitely has a place. But once you put it there, you're never going to get rid of it. It's almost like bamboo. The only way to get rid of it is to move. So you have to be committed to it as a ground cover and maintain it. Cedar sedge. I think it's a neat addition to a garden as a soft contrast to some of the hardscapes, and it can be tucked in between rocks. It can be tucked in pathways. It's really nice. It does do well in the shade, and it can handle a little bit of sun. So something to add just a little bit of softness to a hardscape. Lemnian is a beautiful little plant. Just variegated leaf, full of pink flower. Definitely a nice addition to a garden. Can be spread out like a ground cover as well. Again, it's variegated, which is nice, but then you don't want to put too much variegation in your garden. Vinca, Vinca regular or the variegated Vinca. Great addition to a garden as well, but it will also, all vines and ground covers like to travel. That's their nature. So just make sure it's contained. Mexican petunia. The bottom is the standard petunia, which is a taller variety. That is not something I recommend because it throws its seeds and you'll have it everywhere in your yard. Now the dwarf Ruella Mexican petunia, which is right up here, that one does throw its seeds, and it will come up in other places, but it's a very dwarf and small. You can just pick up the seedling and throw it away, pull it out of the ground, but it fills in and makes a nice ground cover. And why do I recommend this for shade gardens? Because you know those little things, they grow in the shade. I have them in the shade, I have them in the sun. They're a twofer, just like some of the other plants. They do both sun and shade. So love them. They come in pink, white, blue, and I have all of them. I tuck them into rocks and round rocks, groupings and stuff, and they just do great. So great addition. I want to thank you guys. I hope you learned a lot about shade gardening, how we're layering in the plants to produce a great shade garden for your yard. And if you ever have any questions, you can always reach out to Tarrant County Master Gardeners. Um, and we are just a phone call away or an email away. So you can take a screenshot of this and you can reach out to us and ask us a question. But thank you so much for your time, and we'll take questions right after this.